My name is Ava Whitmore. I'm 32 years old. And the day my husband died, my mother-in-law asked me for the keys to his office before she asked how I was holding up. At the funeral, she cried harder than anyone. 3 months later, I found out why. Because hidden behind a false wall in that office was a locked metal box containing 22 years of bank records, a handwritten confession, and one photograph that turned my husband's entire family against each other overnight. But that's not even the part that changed my life. The part that changed my life was what my mother-in-law did when she realized I had found it. 6 years later, people still ask me why I never called the police that first night. The answer is simple. I didn't know I was the one in danger yet. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people discover what happens when family secrets finally run out of places to hide. If you've ever trusted someone simply because they shared your last name, this story is for you. Take a moment to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me tell you about the night my husband left me a mystery instead of a goodbye. My husband, Ethan, died on a rainy Tuesday in September. 41 years old, healthy, successful, gone in less than 30 seconds. A delivery truck crossed the center line outside Charlottesville, and everything after that became paperwork. That's what nobody tells you about grief. The crying gets all the attention. The paperwork does the real damage: death certificates, insurance forms, bank accounts, property transfers, meetings with people who suddenly need things from you. I spent weeks signing my name until it stopped looking like a word. By October, I couldn't remember what day it was without checking my phone. I lived alone in the farmhouse Ethan and I had restored together. No children, no siblings, just me and an old yellow Labrador named Cooper who spent most evenings sleeping beside the fireplace. The house sat on 12 acres of rolling Virginia farmland. Peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where you could hear crickets from the front porch, and for nearly 8 years it had been home. Then Margaret Caldwell decided she wanted it. Margaret was my mother-in-law, 64 years old, impeccably dressed, always smiling. The kind of woman who could insult you while sounding like she was offering a compliment. The first time I met her, she looked me up and down and said, "Ethan always did have a soft spot for strays." Then she laughed and claimed it was a joke. That was Margaret. Every cruel thing came wrapped in ribbon. Every insult arrived wearing perfume. For years, Ethan handled her. He'd change the subject, redirect conversations, pull me out of rooms before things escalated. I never realized how much work he was doing until he wasn't there anymore. 3 days after the funeral, Margaret appeared at my front door carrying a casserole dish. She hugged me, told me how strong I was, cried into my shoulder. Then she asked for the office key. Not Ethan's watch, not a photograph, not one of his old jackets. The office key. I remember blinking at her. "What office key?" "The one for Ethan's workshop," she said immediately. Too quickly, like she'd rehearsed it. Behind our barn sat a detached building Ethan called his office. Half workshop, half private retreat. He repaired antique furniture there, built cabinets, spent weekends working on projects. Nobody went inside without asking. Not even me, especially not Margaret. So hearing her ask for the key felt strange. I told her I didn't know where it was. That was true. She smiled, nodded, said she understood. But something flickered behind her eyes, not disappointment, worry. Then it disappeared, and she left. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Grief makes you miss things. Over the next month, she kept returning, always with a reason: a casserole, a pie, a stack of sympathy cards she'd forgotten to bring earlier. Every visit eventually circled back to the same question. Had I found the office key yet? Did I know what Ethan kept in there? Was I planning to clean it out soon? One afternoon, she even offered to do it herself. "There's no sense holding onto clutter," she said gently. Clutter, that's how she described the room where my husband had spent thousands of hours. Something about that bothered me, but I couldn't explain why. Then one evening, while searching through Ethan's dresser for an insurance document, I found an envelope taped beneath the bottom drawer. Just one envelope, plain white, my name written across the front. AVA, nothing else, no stamp, no date. My heart stopped, because Ethan wasn't the kind of man who left notes. He barely texted. If he'd written something down, it mattered. Inside was a single sheet of paper, only 3 sentences. "If you're reading this, something happened before I could explain everything. Do not give my mother access to the workshop. And whatever she tells you, don't believe her until you find the box. I read it 4 times, then a fifth, then a sixth. Because the last sentence made absolutely no sense. Find what box? What was he talking about? And why would Ethan warn me about his own mother? I sat alone at our kitchen table until nearly midnight, the letter beside me. Cooper asleep at my feet, rain tapping softly against the windows. For the first time since Ethan died, grief stepped aside long enough for another feeling to take its place. Fear. Because suddenly his mother's obsession with that workshop didn't look strange anymore. It looked deliberate. And deep down, I had the awful feeling that whatever Ethan had been trying to protect, Margaret already knew exactly where it was. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 4 years. I told my manager I wasn't feeling well. That wasn't exactly a lie. By sunrise, I'd read Ethan's letter at least 20 times. The paper already felt worn around the edges. 3 sentences, that was all he'd left me. 3 sentences capable of turning grief into suspicion. I made coffee, fed Cooper, then drove to the barn. The workshop sat about 70 yards behind the house. White siding, green metal roof. The same building Ethan had spent years restoring board by board. I stood outside staring at the door. For 8 years, I'd respected his privacy. Not because he demanded it, because he rarely asked for anything. If Ethan wanted 1 room to himself, I gave him 1 room to himself. Now he was gone, and apparently he'd left me a treasure hunt. Finding the key took less than 10 minutes. That should have been my first clue. Margaret had acted as though it was lost, impossible to locate, some great mystery. The key was taped underneath Ethan's workbench in the garage. Exactly where he'd hidden our spare house key, exactly where he'd hidden everything important. I unlocked the workshop and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Sawdust, machine oil, coffee, Ethan. For 1 painful second, I forgot he was dead. I actually expected him to look up from a project and ask what I was doing. Then reality returned, and the silence felt unbearable. Nothing looked unusual. Tools hung neatly on pegboards. Cabinets lined the walls. A drafting table sat beside the windows. Everything was organized. Everything was ordinary. I spent 2 hours searching. Nothing, no box, no secret, no explanation. Just furniture plans, woodworking magazines, and enough screws to build a second house. Around noon, I sat on a stool and stared at Ethan's note again. Find the box. Simple instruction. Assuming you knew where to look. I didn't. Then I noticed something strange. The floor plan. Ethan had drawn dozens of workshop sketches over the years. Most were pinned to a corkboard. 1 sketch showed measurements, room dimensions, window placements, storage layouts. I stared at the numbers, then stared at the actual room, then looked back again. Something didn't match. The back wall should have been 6 feet longer. At first I assumed I'd misread it. Then I measured, twice. Same result, 6 missing feet. A 6-foot section of space existed on paper but not in reality. I felt my stomach tighten, because old farm buildings don't accidentally lose 6 feet. The false wall took another hour to find. A row of cabinets concealed it. Heavy oak units bolted together. Ethan had built them himself. Behind the far right cabinet, hidden beneath years of dust, sat a narrow metal latch. My hands actually shook. I pulled it. A section of wall swung inward. And suddenly there it was. A hidden room, not a large room, maybe 6 feet by 8. Concrete floor, single light bulb, 1 metal filing cabinet, 1 folding chair, and 1 black steel lockbox sitting on a shelf, nothing else. No furniture, no decorations, just the box. The box Ethan had written about, the box his mother desperately wanted. The box I'd just spent 4 hours finding. I remember laughing, not because anything was funny. Because the situation had become absurd. My dead husband had apparently built a secret room. Normal people don't build secret rooms. Normal people definitely don't hide mysterious lockboxes inside them. The key sat taped underneath the shelf, like Ethan expected me to find it. Like he'd planned every step. The lock clicked open, and my entire life changed. Inside were hundreds of pages, bank statements, property records, tax documents, letters, photographs, folders labeled by year. 22 years worth of records, organized meticulously, documented carefully, preserved intentionally. Ethan hadn't hidden random paperwork. He'd built an archive, evidence. I opened the first folder. Within 5 minutes, I understood 2 things. First, my husband had been investigating something for years. Second, That something involved his mother. Every page connected back to Margaret Caldwell. Bank transfers, property purchases, shell companies, money moving through accounts under different names. Nothing obviously illegal, not yet, but enough to make my head spin. Then I found the photograph, a simple picture. 4 people standing outside a courthouse. Margaret, a man I didn't recognize, a teenage girl, and Ethan. Young, maybe 19. Everyone looked miserable. Someone had written a date across the back. June 14th, 2002. Beneath it, in Ethan's handwriting, the day she ruined everything. I stared at the photograph. Who was the girl? Who was the man, and what exactly had happened that day? The answers weren't in that folder, but something else was. A sealed envelope. Written in Ethan's handwriting, open only if she finds the box first. She, not mom, not Margaret, she. And somehow that terrified me more, because Ethan wasn't worried about whether someone would find the box. He was worried about who found it first. And judging by everything I'd seen so far, his mother wasn't the only person looking. For nearly a minute, I just stared at the envelope. My husband's handwriting looked calm, deliberate, like he'd written it on an ordinary Tuesday, like he wasn't leaving behind a warning capable of unraveling his entire family. The words sat there in black ink, open only if she finds the box first. I didn't want to open it, that's the truth. Every page I'd read that morning had made my life stranger. I wasn't sure I wanted stranger. But Ethan had hidden a room behind a false wall. At a certain point, normal decisions stopped being an option. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter, 3 pages long. I recognized the paper immediately. It came from a leather notebook Ethan kept locked in his desk. The notebook he never let anyone read, not even me. Ava, if you're reading this letter, then one of 2 things happened. Either I died before finishing what I started, or my mother got to the box before I could stop her. If it's the second one, call Daniel Mercer immediately. Do not wait. Do not ask questions. Call him. The name meant nothing to me. Daniel Mercer. I had never heard it before. Not once. The letter continued. If it's the first reason, then you deserve an explanation. I have spent the last 9 years trying to prove something I wish wasn't true. The room suddenly felt colder. 9 years, 9 years. We had been married for 8. Which meant this investigation started before our wedding, before our honeymoon, before our entire marriage. My chest tightened. How much of Ethan's life had I never known? I kept reading. In 2002, my mother gained control of assets that never belonged to her. The official story says she inherited them. The real story is more complicated. Complicated. That was Ethan's favorite word whenever something was very bad. The next sentence made my stomach drop. The people who lost those assets never stopped looking. I read it twice. Then 3 times, lost, not sold, not transferred, lost. That implied victims, real people, real families. And apparently they had spent more than 2 decades searching for answers. Then I reached the final page. The final paragraph. The paragraph that kept me awake for weeks afterward. If anything happens to me unexpectedly, start with June 14th, 2002. Everything begins there. The girl in the photograph knows what happened. My mother has spent 20 years making sure nobody finds her. The letter ended with, I love you, trust your instincts, and don't trust Margaret, not even if she cries. I sat alone in the hidden room for a long time, trying to process everything. The girl, the photograph, the courthouse. June 14th. Daniel Mercer, 22 years of records, and a mother-in-law who suddenly looked less like a controlling parent and more like someone hiding a secret. Then my phone rang. The sound nearly made me jump. Margaret, of course, Margaret. I let it ring twice, 3 times, 4, then answered. Hello? Silence, not complete silence, breathing. She was listening, waiting. Finally she spoke. Where are you? Not how are you, not are you okay, where are you? My stomach tightened. Because somehow she sounded nervous, very nervous. I'm home. Another pause, then, have you been in Ethan's workshop? The room went completely still. I looked at the hidden wall, the lockbox, the documents, the photograph. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. She didn't know. She wasn't asking because she knew I'd found it. She was asking because she was afraid I might. I answered carefully. No, a lie, my first lie to Margaret, not my last. She exhaled, actually exhaled, relief, real relief. Then she laughed lightly. Oh, good, good, the word echoed in my head. Good, because apparently the worst thing Margaret Caldwell could imagine was me entering my dead husband's workshop. Why? What exactly was she afraid I'd find? The answer was probably sitting in the lockbox. I just hadn't found it yet. That evening, something even stranger happened. A black SUV parked across the road from my house. At first, I assumed it belonged to a neighbor, but it stayed. For hours, engine off, driver inside, watching, not approaching, just watching. By sunset, I was officially uncomfortable. By dark, I was frightened. I closed every curtain, locked every door, checked every window. Then sat in the living room with Cooper sleeping beside me, trying very hard not to imagine things. Around 10:30 p.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it. That night, I answered immediately. Hello? A man's voice, low, careful. Mrs. Whitmore? Yes. Silence. Then, my name is Daniel Mercer. Every muscle in my body locked. The name from Ethan's letter. The name he'd told me to call. The name I'd never heard before today. I sat up straighter. What is this about? The man sighed. The sound carried years of exhaustion. Your husband contacted me 6 months ago. My pulse started racing. 6 months. That was shortly before Ethan died. Daniel continued. He told me if anything happened to him, eventually you'd find the box. The room felt very small, very quiet. How do you know about the box? Another pause, then. Because I helped him build the case. Case, not investigation, case. Legal language, serious language, dangerous language. I swallowed hard. What case? The answer came immediately. The case against your mother-in-law? Outside, through a tiny gap in the curtains, I saw headlights flash. The black SUV was still parked across the road, still watching, still waiting, and for the first time since Ethan died. I started wondering whether Margaret Caldwell wasn't the only person searching for that hidden room. I didn't sleep that night. Not after Daniel Mercer called, and definitely not with a black SUV sitting across from my house. Every time I looked through the curtains, it was still there, silent, motionless, waiting. By 2 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with Ethan's documents spread across every available surface. Cooper lay at my feet, growling occasionally toward the front window, which wasn't helping at all. Daniel had given me exactly one instruction before hanging up. Don't tell anyone you found the box. Not even be careful, not lock your doors, just don't tell anyone. The way he'd said it made my skin crawl because it sounded less like advice and more like experience. The kind of experience people gain after watching bad things happen. The next morning, the SUV was gone. No tire tracks. No note, nothing, like it had never been there. For a moment, I wondered if grief was finally affecting my judgment. Then I found footprints. Fresh, leading from the road toward the barn, stopping about 20 yards short of the workshop. Then turning back, someone had come onto my property, someone had approached the workshop. Someone had decided not to continue. My stomach tightened, because that meant they knew exactly where to go. At 10 o'clock, Daniel arrived. He was older than I expected. Mid-50s, gray hair, navy jacket, the kind of face that looked permanently tired, not weak, just exhausted, like he'd spent years fighting battles nobody else knew existed. He introduced himself quietly, then immediately asked, "Did Margaret contact you after Ethan died?" Not hello, not condolences, straight to the point. I nodded. "Several times," Daniel sighed, as if I'd confirmed something. "Did she ask about the workshop?" Again, I nodded, more sighing, more confirmation. The man wasn't gathering information. He was verifying it. We sat at my kitchen table for nearly 3 hours, and for most of that time, I listened. Because Daniel knew things, a lot of things. Apparently, he'd spent almost a decade helping Ethan investigate, not professionally, personally. The two of them met through a property records dispute years earlier. One conversation became another. Then another. Eventually, they realized they were chasing the same mystery. Margaret Caldwell, June 14, 2002, the missing assets, the missing girl, the girl in the photograph. I slid it across the table. Daniel's expression changed instantly. Recognition, immediate recognition. He knew her, without question. My pulse quickened. "Who is she?" Daniel stared at the picture for several seconds, then leaned back. For the first time all day, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Her name is Rachel Bennett." The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it told me it should. What happened to her? Long silence. Then, nobody knows. I stared. What do you mean nobody knows? Daniel rubbed his forehead. The answer clearly frustrated him. She disappeared. The room went silent, completely silent. Disappeared, he nodded. 3 weeks after that photograph was taken, my heart started pounding, because suddenly the story had become much darker, not financial, not legal, personal, human, terrifying, Daniel continued. Rachel was 19. She was supposed to inherit part of the estate. The estate, of course, everything always led back to the estate, the money, the assets, the transfers, the missing records. Then Daniel dropped the sentence that changed everything. Rachel was Charles Caldwell's daughter. I blinked. What? He pointed to Margaret in the photograph, then to Rachel, then looked directly at me. Margaret knew her. The room seemed to tilt. Because suddenly June 14th looked very different. Very different. Not a business transaction, not paperwork, people, family, inheritance, loss. I pulled Ethan's notes closer. Searching, scanning, and suddenly I saw it. A page I'd overlooked. One line circled 3 times in red ink. Rachel signed under pressure. My stomach dropped because Ethan hadn't been investigating theft, not entirely. He'd been investigating coercion, manipulation, possibly fraud. And Rachel had been at the center of it. Daniel noticed the note, his expression darkened. That's the document we've never found. What document? The original transfer? I frowned. Why is it important? Daniel laughed bitterly. Because apparently the answer was obvious to him. If Rachel signed willingly, Margaret wins. The room became very quiet. If she didn't, Daniel looked directly at me. Everything Margaret owns disappears. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then a realization hit me, cold, sharp, terrifying. I looked at Daniel. Margaret isn't looking for money anymore. He nodded immediately. Like he'd already reached the same conclusion. No, I swallowed hard. She's looking for that document. Daniel's expression turned grim. Exactly. And suddenly the workshop made sense. The box, the secret room, the repeated visits. The locksmith, the pressure, the watching SUV. Margaret didn't care about Ethan's tools or memories or property. She cared about one piece of paper, one missing document capable of destroying everything she'd built. Then Daniel asked a question, a simple question, one Ethan had apparently spent years trying to answer. Ava, I looked up. What? He tapped the photograph. Why do you think Ethan hid this picture? I stared at Rachel's face. Young. Nervous, unhappy. A girl trapped in a moment she clearly didn't want to be part of. Then I noticed something tiny, something I'd missed 3 times already, a necklace. Rachel was wearing a silver necklace, oval pendant, small, ordinary. Except Ethan had drawn a circle around it. A tiny pencil circle, almost invisible. My pulse quickened, because Ethan never circled things accidentally. Never. Daniel leaned forward. What is it? I turned the photograph over. And for the first time I noticed words written beneath the date, words hidden beneath years of fading ink. Words Ethan had clearly added later. 5 simple words. The key was always hers, and suddenly I knew the necklace wasn't jewelry. It was evidence, and somewhere out there, Rachel Bennett might still be alive. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The photograph sat between us on the kitchen table. Rachel Bennett, 19 years old, scared, unhappy. Wearing a necklace Ethan had circled, and beneath the photograph, the key was always hers. Daniel stared at the words, then slowly leaned back in his chair. My God! The way he said it made my stomach tighten, because it wasn't surprise. It was realization, the kind that arrives all at once. What? I asked. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. Ethan figured it out. My pulse quickened. Figured what out? Daniel looked directly at me. The original transfer document? Silence. Then, we've spent years assuming it was destroyed. The room went still, completely still, because if it wasn't destroyed, then somebody had it. And apparently Rachel's necklace somehow mattered. A lot. Daniel asked if he could photograph the picture. I agreed. Within 10 minutes he was making calls, 3 of them, each shorter than the last. By the 4th call, his voice had changed. Excitement. Real excitement. The first I'd seen all day. When he finally hung up, I couldn't wait anymore. What is it? He looked at me, then at the photograph, then back at me. That necklace wasn't custom jewelry. My heart started pounding. It wasn't, no, he pointed toward the oval pendant. That pendant was actually a miniature storage capsule. I stared. What? Daniel nodded. Popular in the late 90s. My brain struggled to keep up. Storage capsule. Inside a necklace, apparently my confusion showed because Daniel immediately explained. People used them to carry tiny items. Notes, keys, microfilm, memory cards, anything small, anything important. The room suddenly felt colder. Because Ethan had circled the necklace for a reason, not because Rachel wore it, because he knew what it contained, or had once contained. That night I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel. For 22 years she'd existed only as a face in a photograph. A missing girl, a missing heir, a missing witness. Maybe dead, maybe alive, maybe carrying the truth all along. The possibility felt impossible. And yet, Ethan had spent nearly a decade chasing it, which meant he believed it too. The next morning brought another surprise. Mark Caldwell showed up, Margaret's younger brother, not Ethan's brother, Margaret's brother, someone I hadn't seen since the funeral. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept. Like he'd spent the entire night arguing with himself. Ava, his voice shook, not much, just enough. Can I come in? Everything in me screamed no, but Ethan trusted very few people, and Mark was one of them, so I stepped aside. The moment he entered the kitchen, he noticed the photograph. His face went white, actually white. The color disappeared completely, and suddenly I knew Mark recognized Rachel. Immediately, where did you get this? Not who, not what, where. The question answered itself. He knew exactly what he was looking at. I exchanged a glance with Daniel, then pushed the photograph toward him. Mark stared, silent, for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, he whispered, "I thought she was dead." The room froze. Daniel leaned forward. "So did your sister?" Mark looked up, and for the first time I saw genuine fear, not fear of getting caught, fear of being right. "What happened in 2002? I asked. No one spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, "Tell her." Mark swallowed hard. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Then he started talking, and every word made things worse. Rachel Bennett wasn't just Charles Caldwell's daughter. She was his only child. His only heir. Everything legally belonged to her. Everything, the properties, the investments, the businesses, all of it. Then Charles died unexpectedly. And within weeks, Rachel disappeared. Officially, she left town, started over somewhere else. That was the story, the public story. The story Margaret repeated for 22 years. The story everyone accepted, except Ethan. And apparently Mark, because Mark never believed it, not for a second. I saw them arguing. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Who? Rachel and Margaret?" The room went silent. Mark looked down at the table. Like he hated remembering. 3 days before Rachel vanished. My pulse accelerated. What were they arguing about? Mark laughed bitterly. Money, of course, always money. Then he looked at me. And what he said next changed everything. Rachel refused to sign. The room stopped completely because suddenly Ethan's note made sense. Rachel signed under pressure, except she hadn't, not originally. Mark continued. She said she'd never give Margaret control. Daniel and I exchanged another look, the same realization hitting both of us. If Rachel refused to sign, then the transfer shouldn't exist, which meant forgery again, the same answer. The same ugly answer, after all these years. Then Mark said something neither of us expected, something so shocking that even Daniel froze. 2 weeks ago, my stomach tightened, because recent events are always dangerous. 2 weeks ago what? Mark looked directly at me and whispered, "I got a postcard." Silence, then, from Rachel. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, nothing, because the impossible had just become possible. Mark reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded postcard, and slid it across the table. I grabbed it immediately. The image on the front showed a lighthouse overlooking the ocean, nothing unusual, but the handwriting on the back. My pulse exploded. 3 words. Only 3, she's still watching. No signature, no return address, nothing except one detail, one tiny detail. The postmark. Maine. Rachel Bennett had been missing for 22 years. And now someone claiming to be her had just sent a warning. Not a greeting, not an explanation, a warning, and somehow, deep down, I already knew who she was, Margaret Caldwell, and if Rachel was alive. Then the woman who disappeared in 2002 might finally be ready to tell the truth. The postcard sat on the table between us. 3 words. She's still watching. That was it. No explanation, no signature, no proof. And yet somehow every person in the room believed exactly who had sent it. Rachel. Because after 22 years, only one person would choose those words, and only one person would know how much damage they could cause. Mark looked terrified, Daniel looked energized. I felt both. The next 48 hours were chaos. Daniel contacted private investigators, attorneys, former associates, anyone connected to the original case. For the first time in decades, people weren't searching for paperwork. They were searching for a person, Rachel Bennett, and suddenly the possibility that she was alive felt very real, very dangerous, and very expensive for Margaret Caldwell. Margaret apparently reached the same conclusion, because 2 days after the postcard appeared, she showed up at my house, not with a casserole, not with sympathy, not with fake concern. This time she came angry, furious. The mask was gone. Completely gone. I opened the door. Margaret marched inside before I could say a word. Her eyes immediately scanned the room. The kitchen table, the countertops, the shelves, looking, searching like someone desperate to find something. Then she looked at me and asked the question she'd been dying to ask. Who else has seen it? Not hello, not how are you, who else has seen it? I almost laughed because finally, she stopped pretending. I don't know what you're talking about. A lie, a deliberate one. Margaret didn't even try to believe it. You found Ethan's records. Silence. You found the workshop. More silence. You found the box. There it was, the box. The thing she'd spent months trying to reach. The thing she'd failed to find. The thing Ethan protected. For several seconds we simply stared at each other, then Margaret surprised me. She sat down, just sat down. Like a woman carrying something heavy, something she'd carried for years, maybe decades. Then she said quietly, "You don't understand what you're doing." The words sounded rehearsed, prepared, like she'd been waiting for this conversation. I folded my arms. Then explain it. Margaret looked away, toward the window, toward the fields, anywhere except me. Then she whispered, "Rachel ruined everything." The room became still, because that wasn't what I'd expected, not at all. No denial, no confusion, no outrage, just blame, pure blame. "Rachel ruined everything?" I repeated. Margaret nodded immediately, like she'd spent 22 years convincing herself of it. She was reckless, immature, selfish. Every word came faster, harder, angrier, until finally she snapped. She was going to lose everything. The silence afterward felt enormous, because suddenly I understood. Margaret genuinely believed she had saved something, maybe not legally, maybe not morally, but in her own mind. She wasn't the villain, she was the solution, the person who took control, the person who fixed things, the person who deserved everything she took. And somehow that realization frightened me more than outright cruelty. Then Margaret made a mistake, a huge one. She asked, "Did you find the necklace?" The room froze, completely. Because I hadn't mentioned the necklace. Neither had Daniel, neither had Mark, nobody had, not once, yet Margaret knew about it. Immediately, specifically, the necklace, the pendant, the key. The moment she realized what she'd said, her face changed. Too late, way too late, because now I knew, she knew exactly what Rachel had carried. Exactly what Ethan had been chasing. Exactly what was missing. I smiled, a very small smile. The kind that terrifies liars. Margaret stood up immediately. She knew I'd caught it. She knew she'd slipped. And for the first time since I'd met her, she looked afraid, not worried, afraid. That night Daniel called, and for the first time since Ethan died, he sounded excited, actually excited. "Ava, what happened?" "We found Rachel." The world stopped, just stopped, completely. My heart slammed against my ribs. "What?" Daniel laughed, a real laugh, disbelieving, relieved, triumphant. "She's alive." The room spun. 22 years. 22 years missing, 22 years of questions, and now, alive, where? Maine. The postcard, of course, the postcard, it had been real, every word, every warning, everything. Rachel Bennett was alive. And apparently she'd spent 22 years waiting. Waiting for someone to find the truth, waiting for someone to connect the pieces, waiting for Margaret Caldwell to finally lose control. Then Daniel said the sentence that changed everything. Again, because every answer seemed to create a bigger question. "Rachel wants to meet you." Silence. Then, "Why me?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Because apparently Rachel had already explained. Because Ethan trusted you." My chest tightened, immediately, painfully, because even after all these months, he was still somehow protecting me. still guiding me, still leaving trails. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning. 3 days away, 3 days that felt like 3 years, and during those 3 days something strange happened. Margaret disappeared. No phone calls, no visits, no messages, nothing, gone like she was preparing or panicking or both. I didn't know which possibility scared me more, but deep down, I had a feeling. Because if Rachel Bennett was finally coming back after 22 years, she wasn't coming back empty-handed. And whatever she'd been carrying all this time was about to destroy the last lie Margaret Caldwell still had left. 3 days later, I flew to Maine. I expected fear, nervousness, maybe even disappointment. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. Because after months of questions, years of Ethan's investigation, and 22 years of silence, I was finally going to meet the woman at the center of everything. Rachel Bennett, the missing heir, the missing witness, the missing girl from the photograph. Daniel met me at a small coastal town outside Portland. Gray skies, cold wind. Fishing boats rocking gently in the harbor. The kind of place where nobody asks questions. The kind of place where someone could disappear and stay disappeared for 22 years. Rachel lived in a modest white cottage overlooking the ocean. Nothing luxurious, nothing dramatic, just a small home surrounded by pine trees. When she opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her. Then I remembered. 22 years, of course she looked different. The girl in Ethan's photograph had become a woman in her 40s, but her eyes were the same. The exact same eyes. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Rachel smiled sadly. "You look like Ethan?" The words hit me harder than I expected, because she wasn't looking at me. She was remembering him. Inside, we sat around a small wooden table overlooking the water. Rachel made tea. Daniel sat quietly beside me, and for the first time in 22 years, someone told the whole story. Rachel never disappeared, not really, she ran, there's a difference. After Charles Caldwell died, Margaret began pressuring her immediately. Meetings, lawyers, documents, signatures, promises, threats. Every week brought more pressure, more manipulation, more demands. Rachel was 19, alone, grieving. Overwhelmed, and Margaret knew it. She exploited every weakness, every fear, every uncertainty, until eventually Rachel stopped trusting everyone. Then came June 14, 2002, the day in the photograph. The day Margaret presented the final transfer papers, the day everything changed. Rachel refused to sign, just like Mark remembered. She walked out, angry, terrified, determined, and she took something with her. The original inheritance agreement, the document proving exactly who Charles intended to inherit everything. I immediately thought of the necklace. Rachel noticed, then smiled, a small, tired smile. Yes, my pulse jumped, because suddenly everything connected. The necklace, the pendant, the key, the missing evidence. Rachel reached beneath her shirt and slowly pulled out a silver chain, the same pendant, 22 years later, still around her neck. I actually stopped breathing, because Ethan had been right all along. Rachel opened the pendant. Inside was a tiny rolled document, protected inside a waterproof capsule, hidden for over 2 decades. The original inheritance agreement. The document Margaret spent 22 years searching for. The document Ethan spent 9 years trying to find. The document capable of ending everything. Rachel looked at me, then at Daniel. Then quietly said, "I was waiting for someone I could trust." The room fell silent, because that someone had been Ethan, always Ethan, but Ethan never got the chance. Then Rachel handed me a second envelope, one I'd never seen before. My name wasn't on it, Ethan's was. The seal had never been broken. My hands trembled. "What's this?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "He mailed me a letter 6 months before he died." My heart stopped. "He found me?" The room became completely silent, because suddenly I understood. Ethan solved it before he died. He actually solved it, Rachel continued. "He promised he'd finish it." She swallowed hard. "And if anything happened to him, he told me you'd know what to do." I couldn't speak, not immediately, because grief has strange timing. You can survive a funeral, survive months, survive years. Then one sentence breaks you. That was mine. The legal process moved quickly after that, much quicker than anyone expected, because the original document changed everything. Every argument, every claim, every defense, gone. The hearing took place 8 months later. The courthouse was packed. Reporters, attorneys, former business partners. People who had believed Margaret for decades, people who suddenly weren't so sure. Margaret arrived wearing her usual perfect suit, perfect hair, perfect smile. But for the first time, nobody seemed impressed because the truth had finally arrived before she did. When Rachel entered the courtroom, the room froze. 22 years, and suddenly there she was, alive, real, standing 10 feet away. The woman Margaret built her entire story around. The woman she never expected to return. Margaret's face lost all color, immediately, completely. For the first time in 22 years, she looked defeated, not angry, not confident. Defeated. The hearing lasted 2 days. The decision took less than 30 minutes. The inheritance agreement was declared valid. The transfers were reversed. The fraudulent claims collapsed, and decades of carefully maintained lies finally ended. Afterward, as people began leaving the courtroom, Margaret approached Rachel. Everyone watched. The entire room, waiting, expecting, wondering. Rachel stood calmly. Margaret stopped in front of her. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret whispered, "I did what I thought was necessary." Rachel nodded, slowly, sadly, then answered, "No." The room went completely silent. Rachel's voice remained calm. "You did what benefited you, and somehow. That hurt more than any angry speech ever could." Margaret didn't respond, because she couldn't. There was nothing left to say, no story left to tell, no version left to control. The truth had finally become louder. A year later, life looks very different. The farmhouse is still mine. Cooper is older, still sleeps by the fireplace. Daniel remains one of my closest friends, and Rachel visits several times each year. Sometimes we sit on the porch and talk about Ethan. Sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, but every single conversation ends the same way, with gratitude, because one stubborn man refused to stop asking questions. The workshop still stands behind the barn. The hidden room remains exactly where Ethan built it. I never removed it. Probably never will, because that's where he left the trail. That's where he protected the truth. That's where he protected me. The photograph hangs in a frame inside the workshop now. Rachel, Ethan, the courthouse, June 14th, 2002, the day everything started, and beneath it sits a small plaque with words Rachel chose herself. The truth takes longer than lies, but it always arrives. And after everything that happened, I think Ethan would have liked that, very much. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves emotional family drama stories, shocking betrayals, and powerful endings. And tell me in the comments, would you have opened Ethan's letter immediately, or waited like Ava did?